It's us or euthanasia, right? We get a lot of those dogs. And it's heartbreaking to tell anybody no, especially when they desperately want to work with their dogs. Us teaching other people to do what we do so that nobody ever has to hear that response is going to be a significantly better situation for everyone overall.
Stephanie Vichinsky has been in the dog industry for most of her life and has spent the last 15 years of her career studying canine behavior. Her and her team have rehabilitated thousands of reactive and aggressive dogs worldwide and recently started the Method Canine Institute, a school for people looking to become professional dog trainers that specialize in behavioral work. Stephanie also has a deep passion for working with shelters and rescues across the country to help reduce the number of behavioral challenged dogs in the system and to give them the best chance at a successful adoption. Many owners struggle with dogs that lunge or bark at others on walks. Why do dogs become leash reactive in the first place?
We have very poor communication on the part of the handler to the dog. And that's because, one, we're not dogs, but two, we're really far removed from nature, from animals. We kind of box our dogs in and say, this is the version of a dog I'd like you to be. If our dogs are experiencing those things, those types of dogs often would prefer to flee rather than fight. And that short leash really limits what they can do. If the dog is struggling within that defensive state, often fight is the only response left.
Leash reactivity is incredibly common. Many owners struggle with dogs that lunge or bark at others on walks. Why do dogs become leash reactive in the first place? And from your experience, what are the first steps that an owner should take when dealing with a reactive dog to start turning those stressful walks into more peaceful ones?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, Nate. I think that there's a lot of different layers that come into play here. And above all else, I think that communication is very gray inside the household. And I think that's why a lot of dogs wind up becoming reactive, either in the house or the car or the crate or the walk or whatever it is. We have very poor communication on the part of the handler to the dog. And that's because, one, we're not dogs, but two, we're really far removed from nature, from animals. We kind of live a lifestyle where we're very disconnected from our food. We're very disconnected from the land. We're very disconnected from the animals. And so it doesn't come as second nature for a lot of these, more recent generations to communicate with animals. And so we have a lot of dogs that are struggling and they're not getting very clear yeses and nos from the family around them. And so the absence of direction kind of leads to chaos. And that's kind of the first problem, because I think a lot of dogs that are, even struggling with poor genetics or struggling with, lack of fulfillment or something like that could still be generally pretty good and pretty low reactivity levels if we just had very clear communication on the part of the owners or the families or the fosters or whoever it is. But if we start going deeper than that, and if you had really clear communication, but the dog is still struggling, then we have deeper levels that are also, coming up short. They're also coming up gray instead of black and white. And one of those is genetic fulfillment. And, I think when humans think of fulfillment, they think of human fulfillment. So like, my dog got to lay on the couch with me today and eat bonbons, and we watched Netflix and we snuggled all day. Like, obviously my dog is living their best life. But if we look back at, the specific breeds, as those have developed over time, we go back to, even further back in their ancestry, dogs really weren't designed. Like, it was never part of the plan, the breeding plan or the nature plan, to have them sitting on the couch eating bonbons, right? Not even some of the ones that, are less athletic were designed to be living that type of lifestyle. And so we have dogs who were specifically bred for, hunting and herding and sporting and these different types of things. And now they're more couch potatoes and they go on a 1 mile walk each day. And we feel like we've really done our job by doing that type of stuff. And we really think we've fulfilled them. But the problem is that we wind up kind of projecting our humanness onto them and thinking that, well, I walked a mile today and that's great for me, or I got to relax all day, my body needed to turn off or something like that. But really what we need to tap into is what makes dogs tick. And sometimes that's biting, and sometimes that's chasing, and sometimes that's running, and sometimes that is resting and sleeping, and sometimes it's chewing, and sometimes it's digging, and sometimes it's tracking. And a lot of those behaviors tend to be the behaviors that we're like, I don't want that, right? I don't want that from my dog. I don't like the biting. I don't like the chasing. I don't like the chewing. I don't like the digging. And we kind of box our dogs in and say, this is the version of a dog I'd like you to be. I want you to be this very humanized version of a dog. And so we get dogs that become highly frustrated. We get dogs that wind up becoming anxious because they have all of these, desires to expel energy. They have all of this mental capacity that isn't being used, all of this physical capacity that isn't being used, and they wind up feeling more and more anxious because they're just not getting the outlets that they need. You wind up getting dogs who are fearful because they just don't get the exposure that they need. They're not channeled into more of that working mindset where they can start overcoming things. And we wind up with dogs with fear, anxiety, reactivity, aggression, right? And it just spirals out of control. And then if we leave our dogs there long enough, there is another sub layer to that where we actually wind up kind of doing damage to the body over time. So if the dogs, they don't get enough fresh air, they don't get enough exercise, they don't get enough, quality food, they don't have good social connections, they don't have fulfillment mentally, physically, emotionally, we wind up kind of altering their chemistry a little bit. We wind up altering their hormonal states. We wind up altering the way they metabolize food, altering their nervous system states. So we often shift our dogs from the parasympathetic into the sympathetic nervous system, and we wind up kind of trapping them there, right? And so we put them in a box again over and over and over again. And then we have dogs who are desperately calling out for help, right? And sometimes when we get the dogs that are so deeply ingrained in those behaviors and so deeply underfulfilled, undernourished, it's very hard to help them get out. And so steps that I would recommend as a dog trainer to, average dog handlers, things that don't take up that much time and they don't add a whole lot of, training to your day, is rather than taking your dog for, just a 1 mile walk on a tight leash, go find an area that's a little bit more open and walk for a mile on a long line, right? Because this is going to give your dog the ability to make some choices, to feel like they're not necessarily trapped in a fight or flight response. If things do happen, give them the opportunity to maybe sniff and explore a little bit. And then things that you can do at home is, get rid of the couch time and maybe develop a really solid tug game with your dog where we can give them healthy outlets for the biting and the chasing and the chewing and all of those other types of things so that the dogs aren't quite so pent up. And then once you kind of have those things on a roll, then you can focus more on clear communication and you can focus on developing a better relationship with your dog, and you can focus on, maybe some techniques that can balance out those hormonal levels if you're already struggling with that. But really, fulfillment is going to be one of the biggest things. And sometimes working on a long line and developing a really solid play game could be a good start to fulfilling your dog and moving him in the right direction.
And something you said too was triggering the fight or flight response, keeping the dog on a short leash. From your experience, does that seem like what's more often than not causing the reactivity, or is there something else besides that, or that could just be one of the issues?
Well, it's one of many. There's so many things going on. I mean, you could take a professional dog trainer and they could walk on a tight leash and probably have the dog doing okay. Where an average dog owner walking on a tight leash might not be able to do that. And that's where that clear communication comes in, because, the dog trainer obviously has more experience. They can read the dog better. They have better muscle memory when it comes to giving, communication cues and stuff like that. So that leads into it. But you also have owners that don't have the best social relationships with their dogs. Maybe they do have a good relationship, with the, snuggling on the couch and, watching Netflix or watching TV or whatever, but they don't have the best relationship when it comes to handling conflict. Maybe they've been attacked by an off-leash dog, or, they've had other issues that have happened in the past while out on the walk. And so there's there's kind of this social friction when they head out, which can lend to reactivity as well. And then the short leash does play a part in it, because if our dogs become fearful, if our dogs become anxious, which are very common root causes for fear and anxiety and reactivity, or for reactivity and aggression, if our dogs are experiencing those things, those types of dogs often would prefer to flee rather than fight. And that short leash really limits what they can do. And so there's only 3 states very often within that, sympathetic nervous system, and that's our fight, flight, and freeze responses. That's where the dogs are going to typically toggle. And flight is often completely restricted because the line is too short. And then freeze is often restricted because when a dog tries to slow down or tries to do certain things, the owner keeps walking because they're like, all right, well, I just got home from work. I got to make dinner in a little bit. I'm trying to walk you for a mile, that kind of thing. And so if the dog is struggling within that defensive state, often fight is the only response left. So we start to get the barking, and we start to get the lunging, and we start to get dogs that are even willing to bite if people or dogs get too close. They get more and more frustrated, more and more pent up. So yeah, the tight leash, unless you've really, really built a good relationship with your dog, really mastered communication, might actually do you a little bit of a disservice. And I'm not trying to tell people to go out there and be like, walk through the city streets with this big long line or something like that, because you probably, lose your shoulders out of their sockets. I'm not telling you to do that, but I am telling you to maybe go in less crowded areas and loosen up on your line a little bit and really start, talking to your dog, allowing them to have a little bit more leeway, a little bit more freedom, and then only interrupting them when it's something that they definitely can't do. You cannot eat that dead bird right now. And we use our leash, we kind of tighten up on that, and we say, not that, but I don't mind if you kind of keep sniffing over here, that kind of thing, and developing our relationship from there. Because then if we have to tighten up on the line, the dog says, well, you're not always like this. You're not, you're not a dictator. You do make sure that I get everything that I need. I don't mind going on a shorter line for you. Or we'll get a dog that says, you've done a really good job, coaching me, showing me what to do, advocating for me, giving me some space. I don't mind walking past this dog on a tight leash, right? So there's a lot that comes into that with that leash length, but we have to make sure that both parties are safe while trying to loosen up on the dog. And that's advice I have to give even the trainers that come through my programs. Is they'll have their own reactive dogs that they bring, and the first thing that I often have to recommend is loosen up on the dog, let them make some choices, start becoming more of a leader, let them become more of a follower, start giving them space where they can actually choose flight when they want to. And it's a really big game changer. You'd be surprised on how relaxed the dogs get. I often tell people, like, the calmest dogs I've ever seen have been strays or dogs that live with homeless people. And they're not getting nearly as much training and coaching and, dog lessons and all of these other things that these other dogs are getting, and they're so much calmer. And a big part of it is that they're not put into boxes on a daily basis. They get to live a more natural life, and that really is the answer for long-term success with reactivity.
And I'd like to go into detail on a few things that you mentioned a couple times. Clear communication was one of them. Building a strong relationship with the dog was another one. And then giving the dog what they need to be fulfilled based on those genetic needs depending on the dog breed. Would you say those are the 3 main components that you look at, or is there more to it? Is there a certain way, let me rephrase that you approach, let's say, a new client that's having issues? How do you evaluate the dog? How do you determine what you think the issue is? Do you have a standard approach that you do, or does it adjust very much dependent on the case and what's causing the reactivity?
Yeah, my very, very first thing is, I know that there's going to be just a handful of buckets that are part of the problem, right? And they're all kind of pouring into the same big bucket, and it's the same for every dog in every family. So any dog that comes in, whether it's for board and train or a private session or something like that, any dog that comes in, the first thing that I look at is what is the state of the relationship between the handler and the dogs? What is the routine at home? What is the structure and the setup at home? And this is the first thing that I'm often addressing. So you have a resource guarding dog who loves to claim every food bowl, every crumb on the ground. They resource guard their crate, stuff like this. And the dog is, snuggling in bed with mom, and now dad can't get into the bed, right? Well, I'm looking at this structurally and I'm saying, okay, we have a resource guarder who's right now in a mindset that claiming things, kind of elevates their status, kind of puts them a little bit more in charge, gives them a little bit more control. And that can come from a fearful dog. It can come from, a more territorial dog. It can come from any of them. But the first things that I'm going to start doing is shifting things. So now the dog doesn't progress to, well, I'm going to resource guard the backyard, and I'm going to resource guard the barbecue, and I'm going to resource guard the kids from you. I'm not going to let you pick your baby up anymore, right? I'm going to try to stop the trend that's happening within the home and kind of reverse it a little bit. And there's oftentimes I'm going to hear that, that the wife loves the dog in the bed and actually likes when the dog growls at the husband, kind of puts him in his place, and you're like, oh, okay, well, we've got to work on that, right? We might have to, work on you and dad a little bit, and then we have to work on you and the dog a little bit, or vice versa. You might have dad who never wanted the dog, or mom who never wanted the dog, and they get very frustrated or something like that. Or, you might have kids with special needs, or you have cats or like chickens. And, we really need to understand what goes on in the home. And that's often where I start, because I guess no different than with kids, a lot of their issues at school and a lot of their issues with their friends and a lot of the issues that we see when they sign up for sports or anything like that. I worked with kids for 7 years before I worked with dogs. And I would say most of their behavioral stuff is coming from something at home, right? There's some type of disconnect at home or some type of issue at home that's causing behavioral issues when you get them into your programs or something like that. So I really think that's a very important place to start, on top of, teaching the owners how to make more clear communications. So for instance, I kind of thought it was funny when you growled at dad when you were on the bed, and I kind of laughed, and eventually I kind of scooted your butt off. That's a really gray message, right? Now I would have mom say, no, we're going to leave a leash on you. And as soon as you jump on the bed, I'm going to say, no, I'm going to grab the leash and put you off the bed. And the dog's going to be a little confused. They're going to be like, why are you being so clear right now? Right? Because before it was kind of a game, and sometimes you didn't like it, sometimes I pushed you a little too far, but we were right there in the middle, right? Making it more clear is going to stop the progression. At least it's going to stop the bleeding, and it's going to help us to backtrack. Once I have that in place, then we can start talking about fulfilling the dogs, playing tug with them, doing things like that. You have to remember, if these people have a very poor relationship with the dog, in the sense that they don't do anything with them other than getting frustrated with them, or they have a very permissive relationship with them where they've allowed the dog to, bite or mouth them or push them or demand from them or things like that, you can't just tell these people, I want you to go play tug, right? Because the moment that they try to grab that tug, or the moment that they tell the dog, "Ow, you bit me," or something like that, if the dog's not used to a healthy relationship of respect on top of love and trust, the dog could very easily kick into a much deeper gear of reactivity or aggression or fear or anxiety, because we're leveraging a relationship that we haven't created yet. And so my clients, we have to start in the home. We have to start with communication, right? Balancing that out a little bit. And then we can talk about fulfillment, because the dog will say, okay, well, I do see you've been a little bit more clear lately. I do see you haven't been letting me eat all the Q-tips out of the garbage can, right? I do see that you're kind of slowing me down at the door a little bit and not letting me just bolt out after the birds and stuff. I do see when I bark at the fence line, you're stopping me now, right? I'm picking up on a lot of these things. So now if I try to play with you and I put a little bit of a boundary on you because you keep biting my hand, or I put a little bit of a boundary on you because you're getting a little too rough or rowdy, now the dog can yield to that because they respect the relationship, whereas before they might actually lash out because of that. And then once we have that in place, we can dive deeper and talk about, hormonal fluctuations and stuff like that. But, doing things like that really takes a solid relationship with the dog. It's going to take a lot of trust. And so that's something that I will address at the very, very end, when that dog is very comfortable with that handler. But we've got to start at the very beginning. Otherwise, we can never get there.
So first thing, it sounds like you're looking at the family structure, and then you're looking at the relationship, and you're trying to build the relationship And then you start working on communication or developing what a lot of trainers call the communication system or communication channels.
Yeah.
How do you start teaching proper communication to these pet owners that are having issues with any sort of behavioral issue, not just leash reactivity, but if they're dealing with aggression or, as you mentioned, resource
Yeah.
guarding issues? What do you first start having them do to get them to understand how important communication is? And one of my buddies who's a dog trainer, he said he doesn't even tell people he's a dog trainer anymore. He tells people he's a dog communicator, teaching people how to effectively communicate with their dog, since that is the foundation of
Sure.
most of what we do, even at all different levels, of
Yeah.
course, at training.
Yeah.
So going back to the question, how do you start teaching them to improve the communication system that they have with their dogs?
Yeah, and it can be really simple. I think when the average dog owner hears, I need to communicate better with my dog, I think they, jump to the conclusion, I need to tell my dog to sit more. I need to tell my dog to down more. I need to put my dog on their place bed more. And they kind of think of more of those obedience mechanics, those obedience cues, that the traditional basic obedience. And really, that still leaves a lot of gray area, because you can tell your dog to place when guests come over, right? And maybe the dog is less reactive, less lungy, whatever, but the dog still doesn't know what to do when it's up. It only knows what to do on the place bed. So the moment we let the dog up, we have a dog that winds up struggling, and we can never have a surprise doorbell visit or whatever, because the dog doesn't know what to do when it's up, right? And so the very first thing that I teach my clients is let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. And in the areas where you cannot control whether yes or no happens, you're going to restrict the dog from participating in those things. So I have my clients keep a leash on the dog. And if they're in a situation where they can coach the dog, let's say that it's the doorbell, let's say they're reactive to the doorbell. What I want them to do is I want them to use the leash to coach. So if the dog lunges at the door, nope, pull back on the leash. The dog moves away from the door, good. We could loosen our leash. Nice job. That's all I want. I want this to show you that you cannot do this, and this to show you that you can do this. They go towards the door again, leash, nope. And they move away from the door, good. And the leash loosens up. I really want them to understand it's going towards the door that's the issue. And it's the mentality that you have going towards the door that's the issue. I don't care that you're in the room. I don't care that if you even go to the door calmly, but if you're reacting and going to the door, that's a no. And if you move away from the door calmly, that's a yes, right? And I continue to show the clients, do that for everything. So I have my duration marker, which means good, or which is good, and I have my correction marker, which is nope. And I teach my clients, you're just going to say good and nope, good and nope, good and nope, good and nope, good and nope. I often relate this to raising kids. So anybody out there who has kids, I want you to think of how much you good and nope them throughout the day, right? So when my daughter was younger, she used to come home, let's say it's winter time. She comes home from school and she drops literally everything that she owns at the top of the stairs. Her snow pants, her boots, her backpack, her wet socks, everything is right there. And I'll be like, nope. Right? That needs to go into the laundry. It's disgusting and it's soaking wet. So she goes, she puts it in the laundry. Good. Thank you very much. And she says, Mom, can I have cookies? No, we're about to eat dinner in about 2 minutes. Okay. And she says, okay. And she goes over and she just watches a show. Good. Right. We finish dinner and she's going to say, well, I'm going to go play video games. Nope. Homework before video games. Right. And she goes and does her homework. Good. Very nice. It never stops with kids. My kid is 13 now. And the whole day is still good and nope, good and nope, good and nope, good and nope. We don't really do that with our dogs. We let them autopilot so much. We think, well, they're dogs. They're going to figure it out. They're going to wind up acclimating. They figure it out in dog terms. And that's why they end up resource guarding, or that's why they end up becoming reactive, or that's why they end up becoming fearful or anxious or aggressive, because that's what their instincts tell them to do. And so if we can just get the good and nope, we can get the black and white game going, we're going to have very good success. Now, if there's ever a situation where you're like, okay, like someone super important is coming to the door, I cannot do anything with the dog, right? I absolutely have to be there to talk to them. This is a really, really important thing. Great. If you can't play the good and nope game, we're not going to play the I'm trying to balance and spin 10,000 plates. You're going to go put your dog in the crate. right? We're just going to go put the dog in the crate or another room. And we are not going to try to balance all of these different things, because if you try to do multiple things all at the same time, you're going to do multiple things poorly. And so it's better to just limit the dog's access to those particular events and bring them back out. And that's perfectly okay. If your dog has to go in the crate for an hour or two because your daughter's having a birthday party and you really want to focus on your kid, right? And pull the dog out. Next time you have grandma and grandpa over, right? And they're over all the time. You're like, do you guys mind that I work the dog while you guys are over so that I can really get him through this? Great. We're going to work with grandma and grandpa. But at the kid's birthday party, when there's 20 kids there screaming and playing and you want to be there for your kid, it's perfectly fine to go put that dog in a crate for a couple hours, or another room for a couple of hours, or the basement for a couple hours, or the backyard for a couple of hours, and really limit how many plates that you have to spin, so that when you work with your dog, you are successful. And when you spend time with your child, you are successful.
And when would they know that their dog's at a level in which they don't have to put the dog in the crate and they're pretty confident that the dog will do what it's supposed to do when someone comes to the door or something like that? Is there certain milestones that you have them look for? And also, mentioning the crate, do you teach your clients a lot of different management skills or ways to manage the dogs in the house by using gates and things like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We'll start with the first one. You will notice progress. So each time a guest comes over and you work through it, you'll notice I only had to pull back on my leash 6 times, 7 times. This time a guest came over, but last time it was 30, it was 40, right? You'll start noticing that less and less. And what I typically tell my clients to do is, when you feel like you really don't have to touch that leash at all anymore, let it drag. Don't remove it. Just let the leash drag around. And if you need to periodically, go grab it. This is my dog walking around back here. But even with my own dogs, when I adopt a new dog, probably for the first 6 months that they live with me, they're dragging a leash around, right? Because I'm creating long-term habits, right? We don't go in the kitchen, right? We don't eat tissues out of the garbage can, right? Nope, you're not staring out the window at the squirrels. We don't do that, right? Doorbell has nothing to do with you, right? My dogs learn that from the very beginning, and I'm very diligent about it, so that when that 6-month mark comes, I can just take the leash off, and I have dogs that understand all of those boundaries. So you'll start to see the progression. When you feel like you don't have to touch the leash very much anymore, start letting it drag. When you feel like you hardly ever have to touch it, even when it's dragging, you can start trying to move away from it. I would recommend, though, at least keeping some type of ability to maybe quick correct your dog or something like that. I love to use little spray bottles. Works really good for just interrupting a dog, creating a little bit of a sensory correction where they kind of have to close their eyes or whatever it is, and kind of break some of the fixation. So if I don't always have a leash on, I might have a little water bottle here and there where I'm just like, hey, right, and kind of turn the dog off just a little bit. Usually by the time you get the dog to that point, a little spritz of water is just like magic, right? A lot of dogs don't care about the spritz of water when they're really rambunctious or they're really reactive or something. Like, they don't care at all. But if you can get them to the point where they're pretty well in tune with you, that little spritz of water is going to mean a lot to them, and they'll shut off. They'll move away from the door, or they'll stop being reactive in their crate or whatever it is, right? But we've got to work up to that. And then your second question was, do I teach people how to manage their dogs? One of the biggest things that I'm going to hit home on with a client is that your dog needs to be crate trained. The crate, the crate, the crate, the crate, the crate. And the reason that I'm so insistent upon that is because we do specialize in reactive aggressive dogs. That's all I get. I don't get puppies. I don't get happy-go-lucky dogs. If I ever have someone call me for that, I am so excited because I'm tired. I've been dealing with the bigger cases for a long time. What I can tell you from what I've learned over the thousands of dogs that I've rehabilitated, almost all of which have extensive bite records, is that doors fail. Baby gates fail. It doesn't matter if it's worked great for a year, it will eventually fail. I find that crates, especially high quality crates, some type of a metal crate, especially with like a carabiner latched through it, they failed significantly less. And it's better to be safe than sorry. So I will have my clients really work on crate training before they address the door issue, before they have the birthday parties, before they do anything like that. And we have crate training courses. They can come in here and they can do sessions with us. If they do board and train, They're supposed to be crate trained before they come in. A lot of them aren't. We crate train them while they're here, so when they go home, they're good to go. But it's just a much better case because people leave doors open, right? They go in and out of rooms, they leave doors open. Baby gates, they're not very sturdy. I hardly know any of the dogs that I've trained would just plow right through those. So getting a really quality crate and having it in the right area of the home where people aren't really going to bother it, then that's usually the safest thing. But managing, it almost always ends up really going the wrong direction unless you just have an easier dog.
And I also want to hit on something you talked about earlier, where you said teaching them the no and the yes, or
Mhm.
the nope and the yes. How do you condition the dog to the no and the yes? And what exactly does it mean to the dog? Are you using it as markers, like you said?
Yeah.
Does yes
Yeah.
mean that to pay the dog, or is it just more like verbal praise? And does the no guarantee a correction, or is it more like a verbal correction where the dog just knows that that's not something I'm supposed to do, but it doesn't guarantee a correction?
Right. So they are markers. And when I'm saying the phrase, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no, I'm taking that out of
Yeah,
the
that's
Bible.
what I
I'm
was
taking it out
asking.
of the Bible, right? But as far as my markers would go, my yes marker would mean you've completed everything that I've asked you to do, right? And it's kind of a release for the dog. And I'm often, yeah, like you said, paying the dog with something of high value, right? But that's not a marker I really like my clients using in the house. And the reason I don't is because there's such a large dopamine spike when it comes to using that marker. And if we're really trying to aim for, I want that dog that's the stray dog or the dog that lives with homeless people or the totally mellow old golden retriever that walks itself through the park, right? It carries its own leash through the park next to the old man. If that's my goal, pumping a lot of dopamine and a lot of energy with a really high charged marker is not usually my way of getting there. And so I will tell my clients to utilize their duration marker, which means I like what you're doing, but I'm not releasing you from anything, right? I like what you're doing. I want you to know that you're doing well. But I'm not releasing you into any kind of free for all or anything like that. And I want you to keep doing what you're doing, right? So if you're being calm with the guests, I'll mark that with good. Keep doing what you're doing. I like that, right? And if I have decent social standing with the dog, not only I'm going to release a little bit of dopamine because my dog's going to kind of feel good about themselves just from the verbal praise, but I'm also going to release oxytocin, right? Which is actually a much calmer and social hormone than dopamine, which can be very energizing, which can be sometimes leading our pet dogs in the wrong direction. So I'll teach them just stick with the verbal praise, maybe even some touch, depending on how the dog responds to touch. And that's how I would condition my good marker. And then the nope is we can't say nope and expect the dog to know what that means, right? I think a lot of people are under that impression. You just say it and the dog knows it. Maybe if you say it loud enough, the dog knows it. And I think often the dog is maybe just, if they do respond, is just responding to the volume. They notice that you're really escalating, but they don't know what nope means until we've taught what nope means. So I tell my clients, keep that leash on. And in the beginning, every time you say the word nope, it's going to be followed with some type of physical correction. And a physical correction for me that I find works really, really well with dogs is grabbing the leash and kind of moving the dog where you want the dog to go, kind of abruptly saying, hey, I don't want you by the door. I want you a little bit more over here. And the reason that I recommend that is because the leash is very black and white. It not only tells them what direction to move, but it's very clear on what it is that we want from them. Whereas using some kind of touch, like if the dog was jumping on people and we grabbed the dog around the chest or something like that and pulled them off and set them down, touch is often, utilized as praise or grooming or some type of social behavior or some type of engagement or nurturing or consoling. And so when we try to interject it as interrupting or a correction, the dog says, wait a minute, do you love what I'm doing or do you hate what I'm doing? I have no real idea. And we have that big gray area again. Whereas the leash, I personally have never pet my dogs with the leash, like, good job, you're so good. Like, I don't do that. And my leash doesn't talk to them. My leash doesn't nurture them. My leash doesn't do any of those things. So if I grab my leash and I say, get off the couch, and I use my leash to do so, it's a lot more black and white than if I pick the dog up off of the couch. So I really like the leash as a very black and white method of communication. And if I needed to pair that with something, I like the little spray bottles. I think those work really well for a lot of things. However, the spray bottle can't necessarily tell them move faster, move slower, go forward, go back. It can a little bit if the dog's intuitive to that, but the leash combined with the leash can definitely tell them where to go and what to do and things like that. Above and beyond our verbal language, because they're not verbal animals, and above and beyond our physical language, which can be very muddy if we're not used to communicating that way with the dog.
Yeah, and when you pull on the leash, are you doing it more as negative reinforcement? You're turning pressure on, and when they comply, you turn it off? Or is it a little bit more forceful where you are manipulating the dog's position, but it is acting more as positive punishment, even at the same time while moving the dog? How are the dogs
It'll
perceiving?
depend on the dog, truthfully. You might have dogs that are so skittish, that are so timid, even if they're like kind of holy terrors in the house. But when they receive a correction that's a little bit more firm, even just like a pop on a like a flat buckle collar or something like that, sometimes it just turns them off so much, and then they're skittish and they don't really want to try again. So it depends on the dog. So there might be dogs where I'm much more subtle with what I'm asking, and then there are dogs that are much more forward, that have a lot more adrenaline going through them, that I might be more forceful, like a pop or something like that. But my pop is always moving them in the direction that I want them to go. We're always kind of controlling that head in the direction that we want to go, because if we pull the head in a weird direction. We'll use my ponytail as an example here. Let's say that this is a leash. If, dog is barking this way and I pop this way, right? I turn the dog. Okay. But if the dog is barking this way and I just keep pulling backwards, I just keep agitating the dog and frustrating them. So we really want to control that head. And so the leash allows us to do that. So whether I was using more of negative reinforcement and I was just kind of suggesting it for maybe that dog that's a little bit more timid, or I'm giving more of a positive punishment event, it'll always be going in the direction that guides the head away from the situation, rather than just trying to almost pull the body away from the situation, because the body doesn't follow the body follows the head.
Right. And I think it's definitely better to use a leash as well. When it comes to correcting, I always advise not to use hands because I don't want someone to damage the dog's perception of what hands mean. I always tell my clients and my students, your hands should mean something good for the dog. You're coming to add value, you're petting the dog. We're not using our hands to knife hand strike the dog, because I've seen in many cases where they are using these techniques where they're trying to poke the dog and they're using that as a correction, and either their timing is off, they're not being fair because their communication's not clear, and then some dogs end up becoming aggressive because of that. They say, no, you're not going to poke me with your hand. Certain
Yep.
breeds are
um,
more likely to act in that way.
Sure. Yeah, they'll redirect for sure. But I'm not against like physical corrections where we kind of give the poke. I do it with my personal dogs all the time, right? They're I can see my female creeping up on another dog because they have a ball, and I know she's gonna pounce or something like that, and she goes by and I'll be like, poke her in the butt, and she'll be like, sorry, right? And she'll be on her way. I think those types of corrections actually require you to have a significantly better relationship with your dog, right? I think when you have a really good relationship with your dog, interjecting things like that, we don't wind up with dogs that redirect on us because they're like, okay, I'm sorry, right? I shouldn't have been doing that. Or we don't get dogs that are fearful of us and they're like, I deserve that. You're right, because the way that you interact with me is not typically like that, and now you are trying to disagree with me, and because I respect you and I trust you, I'm okay receiving that. But for the average dog owner, they don't typically have that level of trust. So yeah,
Mhm.
it can definitely backfire pretty easily, and redirection is
Yeah.
probably the biggest backfire that we can get.
And what you're saying sounded more like a form of communication as opposed to what I'm talking about, where they're really poking the dog pretty hard. And, one of the things I say as well is I try not to ever yell at dogs, and I advise my students not to either, for a couple reasons. One, I don't want the dog to become more cautious and nervous around me. If I start to yell a lot, then I can become unpredictable and inconsistent. But in addition to that, if for some reason I do need to yell, because maybe something's about to happen and I need to snap my dog's focus out of whatever it is that they are currently focused on, I can do that by raising my voice because it's not something that they commonly hear. Or if I do in some moment need to grab or move my dog, I'm able to do that, but it's not like something that I'm doing on a regular basis where I'm trying to lean more towards specific tools. If I'm using any form of positive punishment, I'll primarily use like a leash pop or a remote training collar, of course, going through a certain process. Now, when it comes to adding punishment, I know that one of the big things you focus on, and you mentioned it, is getting a dog to be calm. I believe you have something called 100 days to calm. Is that something that is incorporated as well when you're working with a dog? And I want to go back to leash reactivity because that is one of the most common problems. And of course, a lot of times when someone comes to a dog trainer and they're dealing with a dog that's being leash reactive, it's usually not the first time the dog started to do it. First time the dog does it, they kind of brush it off, but then they're reaching out to you 6 months down the road when it's become much worse. The dog has been practicing it longer. Now it's a stronger behavior, and that's something that we're going to have to fix. When we're looking at a dog being reactive, I try to simplify a lot of the things that I teach, especially if I'm teaching on a platform like YouTube or any sort of online where I can't answer questions that the student has directly. I try to make things as black and white as possible. But unfortunately, there are a lot of gray areas within dog training. We could say, well, let's think about a dog's motivation. We know they're either motivated to access something pleasant, or they're motivated to prevent something unpleasant, or the behavior itself is self reinforcing, that intrinsic motivator as opposed to an extrinsic motivator. And if I have a dog doing something that I don't like, such as being reactive on leash, just throw a hard correction in there. So the motivation not to receive the correction overrides the motivation to do the unwanted behavior. But that doesn't always work. And in a lot of cases, it could actually make it worse. From your experience, why do you think that is? And what are the things that you look for when it comes to determining what approach? Are we going to correct it? Are we going to try to use counter conditioning or like BAT or something like that? Do you
Yeah.
follow any of those formats, or is it
Not
always just kind of
not
adjusting on the fly?
traditionally. Not traditionally. I definitely don't do any kind of rewards as far as counter conditioning goes. I don't do anything like that. But I'm a firm believer that when you give respect, you get respect. And if you have a dog that's been out of control and you slap a leash on them, a prong collar, an e-collar on them, and they go out of control again, and you just light them up for all of that, I don't think that's respect, right? I think that's complete disrespect. And maybe you're trying to get results fast, but fast results are not lasting results usually. And what I see more often than not, though, is you get a dog that one of two things happens. The dog might try to flee from you. That happens sometimes, right? They might try to run away from you if they've got a stronger correction. But more often than not, you're going to get a fight response, which means that they'll either fight harder on the end of the leash or they'll come back at you, right? We'll get a redirection response, or we'll get a freeze state within defense drive. And I see that online, and it breaks my heart a little bit when there's a dog that's highly reactive or aggressive, and the trainer corrects it over and over and over again, and eventually the dog is subdued at that point, and the trainer can pet them and the trainer can do all of that type of stuff. And really, it's not, the dog's still in a defensive state. It's just in the freeze state. So we're not patterning any better state of mind. We're actually running the same neural pathways that we have before, just in a slightly different response. And so the moment that the dog perceives that fight or flight are back on the table, which is usually, when it goes back with the owner and they start perceiving that fight or flight is there, they're actually more entrenched in that defensive behavior than they were before. And that's where we get that, concept that suppression winds up leading to bigger blowups later on. It's because we just put the dog into a freeze state, and they're still, rather than choosing to be calm or focused or even prey driven, they're choosing to stay within that fight, flight, or freeze response, and we're patterning it even harder. So I'm not a big fan of lots of corrections. You probably won't see me do a lot of that. What I like to do is I start things pretty low distraction. And all I really like to do is get the dog getting the dog following whoever the handler is. And that's going to be done on a long line with a lot of direction changes, just a lot of calm movements, kind of letting the dog, if they bump into the end of the leash because they're reacting, great, they're going to hit the end of the leash, but I'm kind of going this way. And I'm not talking about like 180s, they're softer than that, but we're going to get the dog eventually following us, because the dog will eventually get tired of doing those behaviors. They'll eventually get tired from hitting the end of the leash. And I know everyone watching is like, my dog would never get tired. I promise you, if you do this the right way, they will definitely get tired and they'll start moving with you. And that's when I will spend time being still with them. I will share touch with them. I will coach them with my markers and things like that. And then we'll go again. We'll walk again in maybe the area that they were struggling a little bit with. And once they kind of get to a calm state, we'll rest together. So maybe I'll sit on the ground with them. We'll share affection. We'll maybe share a meal, right? Not necessarily my meal, but I might hand feed them, right? And we'll just sit and we'll watch the event that was really difficult for us before, and we'll spend time just relaxing and bonding in that event, and then we'll go home, right? That might be how I might start my board and train. And they don't need to walk through every doorway perfectly, and they don't need to go in and out of their crate perfectly, and they don't need to do everything perfectly just yet, right? It's progress over perfection. And I think that's where respect comes into play, is that I am trying to help you change, but you don't need to change completely today, right? And we've got plenty of time, and I teach my clients how to do that. And it's just a world of difference. They'll call me even just a week later if we're doing private sessions or something like that, and they're like, I just can't believe how much calmer my dog is. I can't believe, that they come to me for affection now. They never used to do that. Or, I noticed that they've never wanted to play before, and now they want to play. Or they've never been very good at eating out in public, and I went to hand feed them at the end of the week, and they ate their whole meal out there at the park with me, right? Because we got out of that defensive state. We started developing a trust, a bond, respect, all the things that a pack member would have, a pack drive would have. And we start getting that dog that's starting to live more naturally, rather than that dog that's always behind doors or tied to leashes or driving in cars or whatever it is, or completely overstimulated by things. We're getting a dog that's really starting to understand a more natural state when it comes to being in situations that would normally make them react.
And when you're walking around with the dog on the leash and you're making those adjustments to get them to start following you, is that done in a neutral environment? Are you doing that at the person's home, or is that what you're doing where the trigger is that's causing the dog to be reactive, or is that what you're working your way up to?
It depends. As neutral as I can get, So if we're at my facility, I'm not in the middle of nowhere, right? So if we go outside and the dog's got issues with cars, I have cars that pass by periodically. Or if it's issues with people, I have people that walk past periodically. But I'm not in the middle of a city or something like that. So we can start here. We might just start in my parking lot. We're just going to be walking back and forth, right? And the way that I'm teaching them to move is very purposeful. So every time we notice the dog's body language shift from anything other than neutral, we're going to change direction. We're going to kind of move at a 90-degree angle and kind of bump our leash with us a little bit and get the dog moving with us. We really want to start saying, hey, that mindset is not something that we need to go to. We want to interrupt that neural pathway a little bit. We don't want to interrupt it so firmly that we actually wind up entrenching the dog in that neural pathway. We just want to interrupt it enough that the dog skips over into a new neural pathway. And we do it over and over and over again. And so if the issue, if the clients are struggling at their house, maybe we work on it in the backyard. And maybe we open the side gate and we walk back and forth on the side gate, and maybe we make it to the front yard or the front street, right? And that's where we work on it. And maybe we sit in the garage and we rest together. We share some affection. We hand feed together or something like that, or whatever it is. Then that's going to start out the situation really well. But I wouldn't be going to a heavily populated area and doing that until the dog is significantly better and the owner is significantly better at the exercise.
And so you're redirecting the dog before they have an opportunity to react to the stimulus that usually causes the problem. So you see a change in behavior, you think the dog might react to the car or whatever it is, and then you're redirecting the dog before they're able to
Yeah.
react to the stimulus. Is that what
Yeah.
you're doing, or you wait for them to react?
Well, sometimes it does. Sometimes they just react before you can be on it, before you can be on it. And sometimes you have to change direction multiple times while they're reacting, right? But I'm looking for any change in body language. So if we went from a neutral state to a tucked state, like more tucked back state, like a fear type state, and I think the dog is going to bolt, okay, I might interrupt that. But if we're in a more forward state, which we often see with reactivity or aggression, as soon as I start seeing that dog posturing, I'm going to say, let's go, and I will bump my line to interrupt them and move them. Um, the reason for catching this is because we're teaching them mindset right now. And later on, when I work with the dog, I start getting to a point where I will let them go further and I will let them make choices, right? I'll let them go to the end of that line. I'll let them posture a little bit and think a little bit. I might even let them woof a little bit. I want to see what choices they're going to make. But in the beginning, they don't know what choices are available to them. So I kind of have to keep interjecting the moment that I see a mindset change and really showing them you have more choices than what you thought before, right? There are choices to move away. There are choices to check in with me. There are choices to just disengage. There are choices to calmly observe, right? We have all these choices available, but you've patterned one choice that's actually pretty unhealthy, maybe not knowing that there are other ones available. Then later on down the road, when I've shown them all of the options that are available, then when they actually react or something like that, and I give a firmer correction and I kind of disagree with them more firmly, they go, oh, that's right, I had all of those other options, right? And you're like, yeah, you didn't choose one of those, you should have, right? And the dog will learn from that. But in the beginning, if we're just correcting, we're boxing a dog in who doesn't know the right answer to begin with, right? And I don't know about you, but in school, I would never do well from somebody who was constantly telling me I was wrong before they showed me how to be right.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. And with the adjusting the behavior before the dog reacts, I'm really big on trying to understand the reason behind everything that I do. I want to know what the dog is thinking about, what's happening inside the dog's mind that's changing the behavior. And I like to think of it as right now the dog has what they think is one option, or maybe that's just what they're presenting. I see this and I'm going to react, whether it's barking, pulling on the end of the leash, backing up, whatever that reaction might be. That's their default behavior. If I notice the dog starts to think about it, and then I can redirect the dog, I can get them to turn in my direction, I can get them focused on something else to kind of feed off a little bit what you were saying. I'm starting to give the dog different options when they have that feeling that would usually lead to the dog being reactive. Now, of course, that's easier said than done. With someone who is a new handler, we talked earlier about fixing or helping them with the relationship with their dog. And I think a lot of people struggle because there's still a large following of the alpha dominance theory. And I think it was a YouTube short, or maybe it was an Instagram video with you, where you said, and this isn't verbatim, so adjust it if I butcher it a little bit, but you said something like you were reading a child psychology book or something like that, where if the parent doesn't have a strong relationship with the child, when they try to tell them to do things, they don't get compliancy, they get defiance. You said it much better than I said it there. But I think it's I think it's the same thing, and you said it's very similar to dogs. I'm really, really big on building a relationship. In fact, the very first thing that I do, just like with you, is I'm looking at the relationship that the owners have. And then if I'm working with the dog, I want to make sure I can build a relationship with the dog as well before I start asking them to do anything. And so I build a relationship, of course, dependent on the dog. You have those dogs that are going to come up to you, happy go lucky golden retriever, they're licking your face right away. You don't have to do very much. You just don't have to damage the relationship. As long as you're consistent, it's going to be pretty good. But there's lots of cases that I've had, and there's one that was documented. If you look up Frankie Inside Edition, it was this bull terrier, and they wanted Caesar Milan to work with the dog initially, and he said he was going to, but then this is what they told me. I don't know if this is 100% accurate, but he couldn't have control of the footage, so he decided not to do it. And then they asked me if I would do it, and I was like, "Yeah, I'll definitely work with this dog." And so, as a bull terrier, it would attack the camera, it would attack anyone that came close to it, and it had bitten its owner at least 20 different times, punctures and things like that. The dog never acted aggressive with me, never tried to bite me, and I think a lot of it has to do with building a relationship. I took time to show the dog, "Hey, I'm not against you. I'm not trying to dominate you. I'm trying to work with you on the same team towards a common goal." And what I like to do with my clients is I'll have them start off because hopefully a lot of people starting off, they have a decent relationship with their dog. Of course, they can make it better, but I have them start with things like engagement training, loading the marker, getting the dog to follow a food lure, doing some basic leash handling skills before we even start doing any formal obedience. Do you have a step by step process similar to that at all, or is it different, or is it kind of fluid based on what you're seeing and what you're working with?
Yeah. So we try to avoid overstimulating the dogs until the relationship is built. So we get like a lot of the resource garters, we get a lot of those things. And so the moment that the dog kicks into prey or defense drive, the owners have a really, really hard time controlling the dog once it gets into that state. And so we don't do a lot of food work or play work right in the beginning. Just because of the volatility of those different drives. And so we do a lot of long line work. We really teach the owners and the dogs how to rest together, which is it's a really valuable thing that we don't talk about that often. Is that, you know, if we go back their ancestry, if we truly believe that they're descendants of wolves, resting together is a huge part of, you know, the family unit, which is what a wolf pack is. And if you see your dogs together, four of them try to pile in the same bed, right? They just snuggle all over each other. Resting together is really valuable. So I teach my clients how to do that. We work on hand feeding. Packs eat together, right? Maybe not the traditional American dog, but packs eat together, right? So we hand feed. We'll teach them various massage techniques as well to start balancing out the hormones, starting to unwind the sympathetic nervous system, and start pushing the dog towards a more parasympathetic state. And we get lots of dogs too, because they're so hardened in defense drive, they don't eat or play to begin with, right? And so we have a lot of work that we have to do before that. And then when we have a default behavior or a default drive that we can actually put the dogs into, then we tell the owners, okay, now kick them on with food or kick them on with play or something like that. Because if we need to stop the game or we need to slow the game down, we already have these default behaviors in play, right? So if we need to shift gears at any point in time, we can, because we already taught that default behavior, and we can get the dog to move back into that when we need to, and then allow them to kind of dip their toes into the water of prey drive or even defense drive so that we can coach them on better choices to make there. Then when that opens up the door, then our clients, play is on whenever you guys want to do it, right? You can even have your dog in challenging situations, knowing that if they kick within defense, you can coach them, and you can also get them out of that state of mind into, you know, a more pack driven state of mind. So we start with significantly less energy, less dopamine and stuff like that. And then we gradually move into those other areas so that if we need to shut off, we kind of already have things layered in that direction.
And to add a little bit to the calm state, if you have a dog that has really high energy, they're very amped up, they want to move a lot, do you have to adjust at all for them? Is it basically getting the dog to simply relax? Like maybe if you have them in a down position, they'll start to relax? Or what exactly are you doing to get the dogs to that calm state?
Some dogs, I mean, if they're like medium energy, when I'm working on my long line work, especially if it's a longer session, I might go 45 minutes an hour. That will often kind of peter them out, because by the time we're done with that, we've walked 3-4 miles, you know, and we've taken some of the edge off with that. If it's a dog that's significantly higher energy, or maybe even high anxiety that looks like high energy, I know not every owner can do this, but we as dog trainers do this, but we bike ride with the dog. And I like that significantly better than play right away. One, hard to control prey and defense in the very beginning, because we don't have any markers laid. We don't have any default behaviors laid. We don't really have the best relationship just yet. So it's not my favorite thing. But biking, the difference is that biking is actually going to release a high level of endorphins. as opposed to a high level of dopamine from working more with food and toys. And the endorphins are heavy painkillers, which work really well for calmness. They get kind of that calm invincibility from a runner's high. And then we'll rest together, or then we'll do massage, or then once the dog has calmed down, we will hand feed or something like that. So if I have that higher energy dog, I'll often do a biking outlet above doing any type of play outlet just yet. And that's how I would work with my clients in their private sessions. That's how I would do that. And if the dog, if they absolutely can't bike with their dog, like I get it, they can always longboard, they can rollerblade, but if they can't do that, they can do treadmill work. It's not my favorite. I can probably say that if you had the choice to jog or walk around a beautiful lake or to run on a treadmill and stare at the wall for an hour, which would you prefer? I don't find it as fulfilling. And if the dog is stressed by the treadmill, the cortisol that is expelled might actually outweigh your endorphin production, which in the long run doesn't help you that much. But a lot of dogs, we can get comfortable enough that we get a good endorphin rush and we can utilize that. But I would say probably 60% of my clients actually bike their dogs and do pretty well with that. So it's a really, really great option. So that's how we would handle it before going to any type of play or anything like that.
How long does it take to get the dog to the point of being able to go running with them on a bike if the dog has leash reactivity issues? Would you start then with something like a treadmill until you built up more of the communication system relationship?
For me and my staff, we'll get them out on the first day. It's They're usually less reactive when they actually get to go somewhere. And if you're used to, teaching a dog how to heel or, having good control over your leash, it's not that difficult. I'm not telling dog trainers go out there and just blindly start riding your bikes. But I mean, I grew up in the 80s and the 90s with no helmet, no brakes on my bike, with, 6 other kids piled on the pegs, and you're like flying down hills and launching your bikes into rivers. And I mean, that's the lifestyle I grew up with. So, my team and I were pretty strong bikers, so it works out okay. If I was working with my client, I would say get out there on your long line and working on that let's go cue in the areas that you intend to bike. And when you've got that all mastered, then you can start biking the dog in those areas. So you're just going to have to rely on the let's go for now, maybe doing it twice a day, which gives your dogs essentially 5 to 6 miles worth of walking per day. And they're usually, because they're on the long line, they're usually, trotting half of the time and you're just walking in the center more. But it's enough exercise until we can get the dog into a good, healthy state of mind. And then usually you can start biking in those areas that you've already practiced, because the dog knows the cues, knows the mindset, how to manage it. And then rather than having a long line, have a nice short line with the line in one hand, keeping the dog on the side of your bike, and one hand on your bike while you ride. And it doesn't have to be anything crazy, right? You might just ride in circles in that area and get the dog comfortable with it and doing well with it. And it works out well.
And when they're first starting, are they avoiding the trigger for the reactivity, or are we already beyond that when they're doing that? Sorry, I missed it if you already said it.
But for biking?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we want them to at least know what let's go means, know how to follow a leash cue. So if I'm biking or something like that, I'll have the leash in my hand. And if the dog starts reacting, I'll do a very similar thing that I did before. I will say, let's go. I'll bump the dog with my leash and I'll turn my bike, right? You're not usually going to be biking in heavy city areas. It's going to be, neighborhood streets that are a little bit more easy to maneuver around. And I'm going to be turning, right? And I'm going to start showing that dog, you're going to follow me just as if I was walking next to you, the same way that we'd already been patterning in this area. And the dog's usually pretty soft and responsive to that. Even if they do get a little flustered and puffed up, they're usually pretty responsive to that. And so by then, I don't usually have too many issues. But I don't recommend people biking in a higher distraction area until they've worked on that long line in that higher distraction area.
And aside from training the average pet owner, you also train dog trainers. Do you have a school for dog trainers, or do you do like mentoring online?
Yeah. So we started the Method Canine Institute. Well, it's been around for a while for dog owners. Like, we have a subscription page that they can just pay a small monthly fee and they can see lots of tutorials on different issues. And then we have our online courses, which are kind of like a bigger set of videos on one topic that dog owners can purchase if they're struggling with different things. But we expanded the Method Canine Institute to now have a full school for people who want to become dog trainers, or for people who are already dog trainers but they want to learn more about the behavioral side, which is really what we specialize in. And so we have 4 levels of certification, three of which are available online. There is the master certification has a in-person component, so people do have to travel to us and work dogs with us. But over the last few years, I don't know if you experience this, and I might get choked up, but it is heartbreaking when somebody calls and says, you're my last hope. And you have to tell them, we're booked a year out. We're booked a year and a half out, and they're like, do you know anybody that's around here that can work with us? And I'm like, they're booked a year out, right? You know what I mean? That breaks my heart, right? Knowing that these dogs we get so many dogs that are, it's us or euthanasia, right? We get a lot of those dogs, and it's heartbreaking to tell anybody no, especially when they desperately want to work with their dogs. And so we kind of came to the conclusion that us taking more and more and more dogs is not the answer. Us teaching other people to do what we do so that nobody ever has to hear that response is going to be a significantly better situation for everyone overall. So we do still obviously work with dogs, but we have our limitations. But now we're starting to gain certified trainers under our Method Canine Institute all over the country. I think there's probably 300 on the map now, that people can look at our map on our website and see, oh my goodness, there's a trainer in Illinois, there's a trainer in upstate New York, there's a trainer in South Florida. I'm so thankful. That's our goal, is just to keep growing this all over the world so that nobody has to sit through one of those conversations, and nobody has to hear a trainer tell them that they're booked that far out and there's no real help for their dog.
Right. And so training new trainers has become a big part of your mission. And
Yeah.
if you were to go back in time to when you were just starting off or when you were looking into becoming a dog trainer, what advice would you give yourself? Something that could apply to someone who is now considering choosing to become a professional dog trainer as their career path moving forward.
Yeah, that's really good, and I talk to my students about this all the time. Programs are important. You probably started training, back in the day where the internet wasn't developed the way that it is now, and the programs were not out there, and the YouTube channels were not out there, and it just wasn't easy to access information. I can tell you that the first 5 years of my career was a whole lot of Google and YouTube University, right? And if somebody actually had a course out there, I'm sure we're all Learberg students, with Michael Ellis's courses that were on there. We watched a lot of those. That's just kind of all there was early on. And I wish there was more access. It would have made our careers significantly easier. So I do think that there's a lot of value with doing programs, with getting certifications, things like that. Great, but I tell my students, do not become a perpetual student of theory, meaning that you feel like you have to go to class after class after class, seminar after seminar after seminar, and you keep saying, well, I just don't feel like I'm ready to work those kinds of dogs yet. I just don't feel like I'm ready to do this just yet. Just don't feel like I'm ready to start my business. You need to jump. You need to start working the dogs, because as much as us trainers like to toot our own horns and think so highly of ourselves or highly of others, the best teachers are the dogs. And if we're not getting our hands dirty and getting in the trenches with them every single day, you're never going to learn the muscle memory. You're never really going to learn what this theory that you keep going to the same seminars over and over and over again, what this theory actually means. And I compare it to, learning a violin. You could watch every single video on YouTube about the violin, and I promise you, when you pick it up, you still won't be able to play it. You have to sit down for hours and hours and hours and make the mistakes and grind and learn how to play it. So I tell my students, go help the shelters and the rescues, that they're all desperate, they're all overflowing. Go out and help them tomorrow. I don't care what it is. Volunteer to be a dog walker, right? Take a job as a daycare, doggy daycare attendant. You're going to learn more there than you ever thought you would, right? Get out there, get around the dogs, make them just your whole day, and you're going to get a significantly better education than if you were just year after year after year after year after year studying the same things under new people and all this sort of stuff. Get out there and work the dogs. And that would be my number one suggestion to anybody. If you want to become a great trainer, touch thousands of dogs and learn from every single one of them. Because without all of the mistakes and all those learning moments, you won't become the skilled trainer. And I tell my trainers that. I said, you didn't pay to come here to learn from my successes. You paid to come here to learn from my mistakes because I've made so many. And that's really where the learning comes down to. So work the dogs. You don't need to take money for it. You don't need to take serious aggression cases. You don't need to do any of that. Go help the dogs in the shelters and the rescues. They'll be thankful for it, I promise. Even if you're just walking them around on a long line, you're going to learn more than you ever thought you would.
And that's really great advice. You can learn the rules of the game, but you're never going to get good unless you start to play the game. And you've
Yeah.
led the way today. Now tell the audience where they can keep following that lead.
So yeah, we've got our, our certification courses. We've got our, our online courses and our subscription page. So if you go to institute.methodcanine.com, it'll take you to whatever avenue in that you want to go. We also have social media accounts. We give a lot of free advice away, free tips, things like that. We're on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, and we have a YouTube channel as well. We're working on a pretty fun YouTube project right now where we are taking shelter and rescue dogs out and just giving them a day worth remembering, just a day all to themselves, a day of fun and fulfillment and things like that, where we can showcase dogs that are available for adoption, but also showcase the organizations that take care of them. So we're having a lot of fun with that. So you can always go watch those. It's kind of like a family friendly show, like half-hour episodes that you can watch each week that come out. Some just feel good stuff that I think the dog industry really needs. So you can look into that as well. But that's pretty much what we offer to anybody who's looking for stuff.
That's great. And I'll be sure to put all the links in the description. So if you're listening to this, just go down to the description. The links are there. And remember, your dog is talking. Training is how we listen. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next time. And thanks again, Stephanie, for taking the time today. It's really appreciated.
Thanks, Nate. Bye.